Hi, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, journalister, for inviting me second time. Today I will talk a little bit about micromobility. I wish I could paint a beautiful picture like Voy did and talk about the beautiful benefits of these kind of alternatives, but I'm a scientist, so I need to show some truth, and my duty is to really portray the reality of micromobility, even though I'm a big supporter of these alternatives. Today I'll talk a little bit about technologies, but primarily focusing on the social part of technology, because I think that's very important to know that technology is great to the point where it comes to society, and then how it's used by society can also change its trajectory. I am Liridona, and I am a PhD researcher at Integrated Product Development at KTH. And I do primarily studies in sustainable mobility and looking at development of new services and its uses by society. My main project has been to work with what we call testing and trying alternatives so that we can increase the trust in green alternatives for society, but also try to understand the usages of these technologies. I've been working in a number of projects for the last 5 years, doing all kinds of experiments with new alternatives and try to understand really what's the true impact when it comes to environmental impact and also the social impact. This project is KTH Mobility Pool Living Lab, where we tested for we did a large-scale experiment in 2 large workplaces in Sweden and tried to really understand, together with users, what's the possibility of replacing cars with small electric vehicles. And we did this study over a long period of time and tried to understand behavior of people and what really happens in their everyday life. And I am also part of a large consortium, Mistra Sams project, where we are trying to look at transformation of mobility in urban environment through disruptive accessibility services. Here we're trying to go even beyond the idea of mobility, where we look at also if we can even reduce mobility by not traveling at all, because the alternatives we have are not really sufficient. And another project, we are looking also at how can we actually help society to transition towards sharing practices, because we know that the sharing mobility is a way to increase the environmental impact, but also reduce carbon emissions. So we are looking at different possibilities to transform behavior through actually empowering citizens to be part of the process. So I'll share a little bit some learnings from all these projects. And frankly speaking, today still the cities look like this, at least in 2/3 of the world, especially in metropolitan areas. So when we talk about mobility, sometimes we either try to go so far into the future or we try to bring a better portrayal of what it looks today, but we are still having a lot of problem with the idea of unsustainable consumption practices. That is not just introducing new solutions, but also really looking at what we are adding further to existing. We already have burdened our infrastructure with a lot of things. But then our future is also empowering as humans, because we try to look at it, we are going towards the idea of decarbonization and electrifying our roads and connecting our services and optimizing our existing resources. And generally speaking, the idea of seamless mobility and integrated transport is something that we discuss a lot in research, but also, I guess, in practice. And a few trends today in technologies are that what I will show is important, because this will help to understand what is the real social and environmental impact of alternatives when it comes to micromobility. We are trying to transition from the idea of owning cars towards accessing services, accessing mobility as a form of utility, in the same way that we would, for example, pay for electricity today, monthly. And then trying through digital technologies to also optimize the current use, meaning that today we have a lot of resources, but there is really mismatching between the needs and the supply. So this is the kind of trend going. And then we have something that most businesses are transitioning, is going a bit from the idea of creating innovation towards the product, towards the idea of more turning into services. And in the last 3 years, we see a lot of the concept of product service systems, where you just offer a full spectrum of solution for mobility. And this is something the most innovative, because also we see a trend that people are really getting tired of so many applications that they have to download. So we are also looking at how we can aggregate the number of different services into one and even make them part of the public transport through one subscription model, for example.
Terribly sorry. Could we change to this one? The unlucky one.
Okay.
So let's keep
Hopefully.
your,
Okay. And when it comes to environmental impact, it's very important to know that not all micromobility alternatives that we see today, like car sharing and electric scooter sharing and all these forms of sharing, really do not give us the full spectrum of how much sustainability they ensure for us. So we know that a lot are shifting towards the service content, so it means that we are definitely entering the idea of sharing economy, but there's also another concept of circular economy, meaning that how much really we are using the existing fleet of vehicle, for example, instead of adding new cars or new electric vehicles into the system. So that is very important to distinguish when we try to support the decision making for these kind of alternatives in our cities. We know that use-oriented services, some forms of product sharing, for example, are very useful, but it's much more interesting to see that are they peer-to-peer sharing or are they introducing just new products. And these two types of kind of solutions offered are way more environmentally friendly than, for example, taxi hailing, like Uber. We think that it's sustainable, but when we do calculations, a lot of research has been happening. It does marginally contribute to environmental reductions, for example. And then we see also something very interesting, that at least people are becoming more involved in the process of change, meaning that we are creating services where people become contributors, like, for example, people sharing their own cars. So this shifts a little bit the power of citizens to decide for what alternatives will be available in the city. And that's something that is very important for the future of cities, and what I'm going to show in a bit. This is the current tech reality, to be honest, because we have a still car-dominant paradigm. And what has happened in the last 20 years is that we have a lot of introductions of what we call product diversification, meaning that suddenly the mobility landscape doesn't look as just car, public transport. In between, we have a lot of new services that potentially diversify the transportation system, and diversification is usually a good possibility for sustainability. There's been a lot of debates around the new entrants, meaning that are these alternatives useful for us or no? But we see definitely that at least if we possibly diversify the services, more people will be able to match make with services needed. Therefore, they will have better access to the transportation offers. However, when it comes to the social impact, environmental impact, this picture becomes more interesting, because in the last 2 years we have been trying to understand what is really promising alternatives for society, and how can decision makers know that they should support Voi, for example, or they should support which type of solutions, because every year, in the last 3 years particularly, most of the cities around the world are having big troubles when it comes to these new services get introduced, they operate 6 months, and then they die. And a lot of failure, a lot of success and hype of these alternatives, but there is also a lot of underneath failure that no one talks about. So we try to look at, okay, what need do these services solve for people? And when we look at this spectrum that, for example, we're going towards from mass transport to individual transport and no travel at all, we try to point where are all these services fitting in terms of solving a need, but also in terms of emissions. And we see quite a lot that micromobility kind of messes up with the idea of bikes and active mobility and just walking. So it solves definitely a need for what is like the short-term distances, for example, that people take the car for 3 kilometers. But they don't necessarily replace the car. The latest study in US done at Berkeley Institute shows that actually the e-scooters have definitely solved the need when it comes to short-term mobility, but they have only 12% replaced the car trips. So people still continue to keep their cars, and people still continue to have their cars, but sometimes, occasionally, they do use these e-scooters. However, it has become also another interesting part that it has offered accessibility to some areas which previously are segregated by public transport. So that's another dimension that, okay, diversifies the need, but it does not necessarily replace the cars. We know still that mass transport is still and should be the main objective of authorities in order to offer really sustainable alternatives. In all of these, we have some form of marginal environmental impact, but not really as high as we thought we could have. And micromobility comes into this place, and it's not just voice. So micromobility is called also the silent revolution, because it's something that a lot of developments in the last 5 years have happened. And actually there are many interesting concepts that potentially can offer much interesting alternative for society. Why? Because they don't require an extreme infrastructure when it comes to charging, for example. Small electric vehicles also can be driven by one person and still do not take so much space. And also they can be much easily to implement. So there are some new introductions coming, like for example, this is the Twizy. This is the one we have tested. This is Bicar being tested in Switzerland. Since also we have to take into account in the Nordics, especially the weather is an issue that we have found. This is the Microlino, which is taking the old school car and turning it into electric. And then this is some futuristic concept. This is Toyota. They also tested in Grenoble, but good results. However, public acceptance is still kind of an issue when it comes to small alternatives. Micromobility is also interesting because it can offer a lot of, it can fit not just with private individual or passenger needs, but it can also solve a lot of logistics problems when it comes to cities, like for example, delivery of services and goods. So there are many different uses that we find when it comes to these alternatives. There are many, for example, pilot projects happening in terms of how to food delivery with small electric vehicles or post mail and so on, which in Sweden is a lot used also with bikes. But as I mentioned, some challenges that we really started to think about are that when I went to the research and I looked at the medical research, then I found that, oh, there is a big problem. In Sweden, for example, in the last 50 years, the walking has reduced by almost 70 to 80%. And the only distance today a normal commuter has in their everyday life, which is very hectic because our days get talked by jobs, so we don't really walk so much. The only time that people could walk was this distance that they have between their home and the next public transport station. And if these alternatives keep up and tell us that they are going to solve this idea of the last mile transport, it means that they will collide with the idea of, okay, walking. And the obesity levels keep increasing also in larger scale cities. So this is another challenge that maybe we need to considering more. So then I started to think, okay, who is right in this picture really? Like what's happening? Should we support them or not? And I had done some studies in California last summer. I was in California doing field research on really what's happening with these developments, and I'm going next week to continue. And I started thinking, okay, do we want a future where the business kind of decides what is environmentally friendly? Like, should we support the idea of these narratives where what businesses are telling us that this is helping society? Or are these really solving some of our needs when it comes to mobility? Like this is a picture that providers give us. And where we have available services where public transport cannot really go. Like for example, being so responsive to the user, where we have these really great services that offer us nice opportunities on demand whenever we need service that we are so excited about, as especially the generation of millennials. We just want right away our solutions. Or do we also want services that really don't function all the time, and they don't provide us all the time certainty about how much they cost to us. The hidden costs of our services that most of these organizations don't really show, but it is not more affordable to go with light electric vehicles like Voi scooters than to go with public transport. Maybe it depends on the city, but the calculations don't show that there is. Actually, in the long term, it's almost same price as using Uber, much more expensive than using public transport. At least my calculations in California showed that. And then there's this other social spillover effect that I call that, for example, I did an interview with this guy, and he was telling me that he repairs and he changes almost every week. Up to 50% of the fleet has to be repaired or changed to new ones because it gets destroyed. And then they have, in California, they have services where the people can sign up to be chargers of these electric scooters, and then they go and collect all the voids around, all the birds, sorry, boy guys, all the birds, companies like these scooters, and collect them and put them in the parking lots of their buildings, and then that creates problem for the managers of those buildings. And then we have also these challenges that city councillors cannot know what to do, really. How do we regulate? Where is the space that these services need? Do they have to have a designated space, or can they really be free-floating as they are today, where people just throw them everywhere possible? And there are also some reported accidents that have been happening because of this undesignated space that they currently share. And also the media portrays also a very, very mixed picture of like, okay, what do we want for our current mobility services in our cities? This is where people started to debate, and then the city of Los Angeles decided to ban all the operators with a pilot design program where they have to prove within the 6 months that they're really going to solve a social problem. And now I'm going to follow up on the results, whether something has happened and what was the agreement between the cities, because of the very chaos that they caused in the entire region of California. Even though they provided a really fun mobility because people loved them, but most of the trips were done only for fun, to be honest. People try them and use them when it comes to more like fun, so we need to think about what need they really do solve. But then we can also collaborate. So it is time that I think citizens and municipalities and business operators really collaborate to find the best means, because we don't want to end up with technologies where they end up in this part. This is a picture I took of Voi when I was going to work one day in Stockholm to the right, and this was in California. These are all created with good intention, but it's important that the citizens also are aware for what reason we are doing this. And I think there is a lack of good communication between providers, cities, and citizens to really understand what's the action that we are doing towards the sustainable development goals. So these challenges are all systemic, and I believe that through more collaboration and participation between different stakeholders, we can decide what is the best way to support these alternatives. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. Thank you, Liridona. See if there's one question from the audience. No questions. Oh, there we have one. We just need one. Yeah.
I'm just thinking about, do you have any studies about when bikes suddenly arrived? I mean, there's always a resistance for change. So when originally bikes were allowed in the traffic, I mean, these I can see the problem with these boy scooters, but do you have any statistics around that?
Yeah, of course there's two resistance levels. Of course, it's the car people who don't want to go, but then it's also people people support these alternatives. There's no resistance. Rather, we are kind of caught at what I call a point of like paralysis, because the changes, the developments in technologies are so fast to the point where cities cannot respond to the speed. So, for example, what happened in US was that within 1 year of introduction, for example, from bike sharing to what we called dockless bike sharing, which is free floating, from stationary to free floating, to e-scooters, everything happened within 2 years. And public authorities, as soon as they started to support bike sharing, they were replaced by dockless sharing. And then suddenly e-scooter comes to the picture, and then these become completely obsolete. So it is great that we have very, very fast developments, that we are really solving mobility problems. But at the same time, I do not think that we have the governance to respond to that fast level. So that's why cities are found kind of in a very shock, like what do? We don't have really regulatory bodies. Like, for example, small electric vehicles were only regulated in Europe in 2014, and still ongoing discussion about where's their place. So there's a lot of systemic issues that need to be accounted to support.
Thank you, Liridona.